60 years ago, the first president of the African Studies Association, Melville J. Herskovits, mounted the podium at the first annual ASA meeting in Evanston, Illinois, in an address entitled "Some Thoughts on American Research in Africa." Herskovits set out the exceptional role of US scholars who study Africa. Because we are removed in space from the African scene, he told his listeners, and because we are from a country that has no territorial commitments in Africa, we come easily by a certain physical and psychological distance from the problems that we study that bring us naturally to a heightened degree of objectivity. Because we have no commitments, we can study many problems without the sense of urgency present when their solution must be sought in the findings of a given research undertaking. There is nothing particularly American in our position. With these words, I wasn't expecting chuckles. Wow. Heartening. Herskovits set the course for the ASA, a course that, with the support of major philanthropic foundations and the United States government, would go largely unchallenged for a decade. The we that the new association embraced with this claim had no connections to the continent by lineage, by language, by imperial liability, other than those manifest in and through scholarly inquiry. Detachment was required, was foundational to the scientific objectivity upon which the ASA was based, and it allowed American scholars who were, in Herskovits' view, neither African nor tied to the fading colonial projects of Britain and France, uniquely able to transcend any parochial, national, or imperial interests. In a few short sentences and in language that was racially coded and clear, Herskovits affirmed the central, the primary role of white American scholars in the study of Africa in the United States, and anointed those scholars with the sacred signs of objectivity and neutrality few others could possess or attain. Writing nearly 20 years later, Columbia University anthropologist and former US ambassador to Upper Volta, Elliot Skinner, recalled, quote, being flabbergasted by Herskovits' remarks. Did Herskovits not realize, Skinner asked, that there were blacks in the audience who would always have a commitment to that continent? What myopia blinded him to the fact that as a white American, he was the citizen of a country with a fatal flaw for continuing to discriminate against people with African skins? Skinner posed those questions in 1976. It was not the first time that they were asked, and it would not be the last. Now, let me begin with a forthright admission. Very little of what I want to say today is original. Perhaps some of the connections, chronologies, or analyses are inflected by more recent scholarly or political turns, but in essence, my presentation tells a story that has animated some previous historical reflections on the ASA, including by some of my predecessors who are comforting me by being in the audience this evening. What these reflections have in common is a counter-narrative of the ASA's origins and of the ruptures it has experienced, a counter-narrative aimed at coming to terms with the ASA's position in the racial landscape of knowledge production about Africa, not only in the US, but globally. The origin counter-narrative foregrounds a history of African studies very different from the one that is traced beginning in 1957 through Herskovits and the ASA and Northwestern and Boston University through Carnegie and Ford and the National Defense Education Act's Title VI. It is an African study so eloquently described by many, but most recently by James Pritchett in his 2014 presidential lecture, where he described that other knowledge river, a river that flows through African American intellectual history right back to the 19th and early 20th centuries, and through the work of black scholars like W.B. Du Bois, William Leo Hansberry, Carter G. Woodson, Lorenzo Turner, St. Clair Drake, and countless others. These black scholars located in historically black universities and colleges constitute a far older lineage of African studies in this country. A lineage built on and through resilient Pan-African bonds, but marginalized and displaced by the massive inflow of resources to post-war African area studies located primarily in traditionally white institutions, which I'm going to refer to as TWIs. I didn't make that up. That's actually a thing. The second counter-narrative is of ruptures within the ASA, ruptures directly related to the marginalization of that older lineage of African studies knowledge. Here the focus shifts to the 1960s, late 1960s, to the emergence of the Black Caucus at the annual meeting of the ASA in 1968, exactly 50 years ago, to the transformation of that caucus into the African Heritage Studies Association in 1969, and then to the disruption of the 1969 meeting in Montreal by Black activists and their allies. For many who have revisited these years, the narrative is clear. Montreal was an unfortunate but necessary rupture which ultimately resulted in a more diverse and inclusive ASA, in which the lines are no longer racial. It was evidence of the association's early growing pains, but there's also been a counter narrative to this all along. When the ASA turned 40, for example, then President Sandra Greene was not so sanguine. I quote, "I believe the association and its members have yet to come to grips with the past in ways that will prepare the association to be viewed by ourselves and others as truly making a difference in the production and dissemination of knowledge about Africa in the next millennium." Though 20 years have passed since Greene spoke those words, I share her wariness. I do not believe, as an association, that we have come to grips with our past, have thought deliberately, carefully, and constructively through our origins and our ruptures, or considered how they continue to inhabit our present. What I would like to do today is to step back from a comforting ascension narrative, as opposed to declension, of expansion, diversity, and inclusion, and take a moment to reckon with the forces that haunt our origin stories and which brought the ASA to rupture 50 years ago. I want self-consciously to frame my recounting of African studies in terms of whiteness and in terms of the racially coded language of non-racialism. So here are the main points I want to make this evening as I mark both the 60th anniversary of that first meeting in Evanston and the 50th anniversary of the rupture in LA, 1968. Number one, I want to argue that the privileging of white scholarship was hardwired into the ASA at its founding. As William Martin and Michael West, two scholars whose critical work on the ASA is without parallel, put it in 1999, quote, "The emergence of this highly racialized field of study, the Africanist enterprise, as they called it, required the purposeful displacement of a competing and older tradition of Black scholarship. That displacement, I will argue, has not been undone. Displacement was foundational to the constitution of the ASA, and it has been enduring. Secondly, that foundational displacement was consciously intended by many of the founding fellows of the organization, and with forethought, to sever any connections with an emerging African American studies or Black studies. And that separation occurred despite the fact that several of the ASA's founding fathers actually found their first employment at Howard University, arguably the center of African studies research and teaching in the US, if not in the world, in the 1920s and the 1930s. And finally, my third point, which has been inspired by calls for the decolonization of knowledge production on the continent and by the fallist movements that have swept from Cape Town to Oxford, UK, from Charlottesville to St. Louis. Long before Rhodes Must Fall, in fact, right back to the early 1960s, the decolonization of knowledge production about Africa was at the forefront of struggle in many parts of the African continent. Indeed, there was a moment in the mid-60s when it appeared that the balance of power over knowledge production was actually shifting decisively from colonial studies of Africa or African area studies back to the continent itself. That Africa-centered project of decolonization was severely compromised by a host of internal and external forces that I don't have time to detail today, but there were lots of panels I saw on that have actually been grappling with this. But what I can say is that At precisely the same moment that Africa-centered projects were being undermined in Africa, a massive influx of Cold War-related funding to African area studies in the US would lead to the emergence and fortification of what Martin and West have called that Africanist enterprise. That US-based enterprise would not assist, let's be clear, in the recentering of knowledge production in post-colonial African institutions, but would rather expedite, I would argue, the rapid recolonization, American style, of knowledge production about Africa beginning in the 1960s. Origins, foundations, and the gatekeepers. Indeed, it's impossible to tell this story of the Africanist enterprise without following the money, especially foundation money, which underwrote the massive 1960s expansion of area studies in the US. While we might disagree on whether or not strings were attached to this funding, when it comes to which institutions were funded and which institutions were not, the evidence is incontrovertible. On the list of beneficiaries of foundation and government strategic largesse, there was generally only one HBCU after the Second World War, and that was Howard University, and funding to Howard paled in comparison to that garnered by institutions like Northwestern, Boston, and Columbia. The massive infusion of funds to TWIs was not inconsequential. It served to marginalize historically Black institutions in the US from the Africanist enterprise and to dismiss the organic Pan-African connections between the study of Africa and its diaspora that had been nurtured for nearly a century at those very institutions. Now, if funding was in part responsible for hardwiring white dominance into the Africanist enterprise, the structure devised by the founders of the ASA, a structure that remained in place for over a decade, in which I bet most of you don't know much about, ensured that that privilege, coded as expert, scientific, scholarly, neutral, was reproduced within the association. The founding meeting of the ASA took place in late March '57 and was attended by about 30 people, a little over. The overwhelming majority represented TWIs that had benefited in some degree from early foundation support for African studies. Also present were representatives from the Department of State, USIA, the Library of Congress, the United Nations Secretariat, and the Carnegie Corporation. Only two HBCUs, Howard and Atlanta, were represented. At that founding meeting, the participants decided, after much debate, against an open membership for the association. In essence, rather than opening it up for all those with an interest in the continent at such a critical time, it was to be structured around a College of Fellows. Composed originally of those who were at the founding meeting, as Gwendolyn Carter would explain, who would then control the nomination and election of officers and the subsequent admission, gatekeeping, of future fellows. Individuals not meeting the criteria to be fellows were welcome to be associate members, but they were not entitled to vote or serve on the board. At the ASA second meeting, there was a letter of invitation drafted that went out explaining the criteria. People had to be of scholarly attainment in the field of African studies. Here is a slide that shows the first president and vice president. And here is the first board. Fraser was the only African American on the board and represented the only HBCU. In the ASA archives deposited at Northwestern University, there are numerous folders containing over a decade's worth of applications for membership in that College of Fellows. In the judgment of the board of directors, one could become a fellow if you met 2 of 4 criteria: publishing on Africa of a scholarly character, a doctoral degree with a dissertation in African studies. And now remember, this is like 1957, like where were you getting a PhD? Okay. Offering regular courses in African studies and making a scholarly contribution to the understanding of Africa. But what is scholarly? Who gets to decide? At what institution and what fields could a prospective fellow earn a degree in the 50s or the 60s? What are African materials? And who gets to decide? Reviewing these files provides a stark lesson in how power and privilege are reproduced. As Skinner reflected in 1976, Afro-Americans felt that the qualifications for voting membership were weighted against the large and distinguished group of black scholars on Africa who, despite their renown in black circles, were largely unknown to whites. Racially coded language, such as that which determined eligibility as a fellow, when bolstered by these massive infusions of funding to TWIs and by the development of a closed elite government structure in the early years, hardwired white privilege into the ASA and guaranteed its reproduction. But all of this, of course, was couched in a broader discourse of non-racialism, detachment, and neutrality. By 1968, the core features of this enterprise were in place, as Martin and West have documented. You got your journals, you got your centers, you got your national association, providing channels for the production of the first, and then the second, and then the third generation of scholars at major research university dedicated to this new field of African studies. In his 1996 Abiola Distinguished Lecture, Tandika Mkandawire, in stark and powerful terms, described the research world produced by that enterprise in those critical first years. I doubt, he said, whether the divide between area specialists and the indigenous scholars is as sharp elsewhere as that between African scholars and their Africanist counterparts. The vocabulary is still binary, us versus them, Africans versus Africanists, and it is these walls that necessitate gatekeeping. Africanists have consciously or unconsciously assumed those gatekeeping functions ever since the study of Africa became serious business. Reading Senghor's, Kenyatta's, Sheikh Anta Diop's, and Nkrumah's, one is struck by the fact that we apparently have been carrying out these negotiations with the gatekeepers for years, close quote. Gatekeeping and reckoning with Herskovits. Before moving to 68, 69, I would like to segue from an institutional history to a brief consideration of Herskovits as the foundational gatekeeper who set the course for the development of this Africanist enterprise. An Africanist whose work bridges African American and African studies, but a scholar who, as many have argued, developed his gatekeeping skills in the 30s and 40s in the context of what was called at the time Negro studies, and then deployed those skills with strategic precision in the context of the Africanist enterprise. I offer these remarks with all seriousness of purpose, including personal. Indeed, my own intellectual biography is fully entangled in this story as a white, first-generation college student who made her way to Northwestern as an undergraduate in 1975, and eventually to African history and to African studies, and who spent countless hours in the Africana collection in the Melville J. Herskovits Library. I benefited enormously from Herskovits' legacy, especially from the affirmative action available to white students like myself who came to African studies at TWIs like Northwestern. I do not, therefore, approach this topic lightly. Let me add two caveats. One, I single out Herskovits in this part not because he's more responsible than others for the ways in which this enterprise developed, but because of the hallowed founding father role with which the ASA has anointed him since his death in '63, including by memorializing his foundational role through the naming of our most important scholarly prize. My second caveat, my concern is not with the content of Herskovits' scholarship. My focus is on the institutions he helped build, which have worked historically to exclude black scholars and privilege white scholars. First and foremost, the discursive weapon Herskovits deployed in his work of exclusion was objectivity. The history on this score is long, it is incontrovertible, and it is perhaps nowhere more evident than in the years before he turned his attention, his full attention, to African studies, and it was embroiled in battles for control of what was then known as Negro studies. As his biographer, Jerry Gershenhorn, writes, quote, in addition to his paternalism, Herskovits' strict adherence to his own notion of objectivist detached scholarship and in his desire to direct the field of Negro studies brought him into conflict with the leading black scholar activists of the time, including Carter G. Woodson and W.B. Du Bois. Herskovits accused Woodson and Du Bois of engaging in polemics and falling short of scholarly standards of objectivity. These were not, however, just wars of words. Herskovits's insistence on so-called objective detachment rendered illegitimate any scholarship concerned with race, racial oppression, and racial justice, and that insistence had real and enduring consequences for the development of both African and African American studies. The long and tortured history of Du Bois's Encyclopedia Africana is a case in point. I don't want to rehearse this long history here, but it is of no small significance that for years Herskovits worked to undermine Du Bois's project, a project that only found funding with Ghana's independence and Nkrumah's invitation to Du Bois to move to Ghana and complete the encyclopedia there. Indeed, according to historian Rayford Logan, Herskovits boasted to him on one occasion that he was the hatchet man who made sure that Carnegie did not support Du Bois's project. And thus the conundrum with which many, including Herskovits's biographers, struggle. On the one hand, you have Herskovits, who, and I'm quoting Gershenhorn here, who devoted his life to discovering the dynamism, the strength of African and African American societies, and then worked to establish programs in those fields, close quote, with the Herskovits who would not cede a single inch of control to a single black scholar. Herskovits's former student, Johnnetta Cole, one of only 2 or 3 black PhD students who he trained, is not quite so equivocal in her reflections. Of course, many of you know, Cole went on to a distinguished career in anthropology. She would become the first woman president of Spelman College and served as the director of the National Museum of African Art. In the film, In Herskovits at the Heart of Blackness, she reflects, Herskovits was driven by the power Africa gave him. Scholarship is never so pure that folk don't have the possibility to carve out a piece that is filled not only with interesting ideas, but with power. Africa was the power platform upon which Herskovits stood. Although Herskovits, close quote, although Herskovits worked with all of the major black scholars of his time, as Martin and West point out, he alone would move to a position of power and stature within the academy. His pivotal position endowed him with a gatekeeper role for the funding of U.S. scholarship on the African diaspora, as well as on continental Africa. Storming the Gates, 68, 69, a redemption song. Melville Herskovits died unexpectedly in February 1963, 5 years after he'd served as the president of the ASA, 5 years before the ASA experienced the rupture that nearly led to its demise. I'd like to turn now to that rupture and again to Elliot Skinner for insight on 68. Skinner had this to say, for blacks, parity, if not dominance, in the study of Africa is inextricably part of their struggle for full equality in America. I'm going to say it again. For blacks, parity, if not dominance, in the study of Africa is inextricably part of their struggle for full equality in America. Skinner was insisting in 1976 that we situate the ASA within the historical context of the black freedom struggle in this country, and not just in the 1960s. 10 years after its founding, the association's leadership was as white as it had been at the first meeting, and appeared more determined than ever to remain detached from the struggles of black people globally, not just in the US. As Michael Searles later recounted in Africa Today, in 1968, the annual meeting in Los Angeles started like many others. Quote, all matters of academic and reminiscences of past trips to Africa were discussed over gin and tonic, with art tours, cocktail parties, receptions, and dinners. But this year, unlike previous years, the events of 68, and this is a quote, had stimulated in black people the necessity to evaluate all facets of their existence. And as had happened in countless associations across the country, black Africanists, quote, came together to discuss how the association might more realistically serve the interests of the black world. This slide indicates the people who first came together to create the Black Caucus in 1968. While those participating came from a variety of disciplines, countries, and political groundings, quote, all agreed the ASA was not meeting the needs of Black people. The nearly 80 participants on the caucus then developed a position paper, which was presented to the board. Now, I just want to highlight a few points from that, and sorry for all the text, but the highlights of that were: ASA, render yourself more relevant and competent to deal with the challenging times and conditions of Black people. Broaden the participation of Blacks in all phases of the association. Representation should be drawn from other persons engaged in interests closely related to African and African American studies, with particular emphasis on Black youth. Finally, there's this rapidly developing African American studies in the US, and the ASA needs to address itself in meaningful educational ways to changing American public opinion. As you can see, and as Skinner commented, these 1968 demands were not the clarion call to revolution. They were rather a request of African peoples for a greater opportunity to work in the association. Still, they were a demand for substantive change, not just in the racial demographics of the association's leadership, but in the leadership's approach to politics and its accountability to those with interests in Africa outside of universities. What is also particularly noteworthy, given the enduring separation of African and African American studies on almost every campus in North America, not all, but most, is the fact that the Black Caucus was insisting that Africanists belonged at the table as Black studies programs were being launched in response to Black student demands at colleges and universities across the country. In other words, 1968 marked, in their eyes, a moment when African and African American studies must be reconjoined. The leadership of the ASA responded immediately to some of the caucus's demand by establishing two committees. We seem to be very good at that. A committee on teaching about Africa, and then what would be called the Afro-American Committee, to consider Afro-American issues. Noted cultural anthropologist James Gibbs, the first African-American scholar to be tenured at Stanford, agreed to chair that Afro-American committee. Members of that committee met on several occasions, and reports were presented to the board, which included some of the ameliorative steps that had already been taken to date. Among those were reaching out to recruit more Black members, which involved sending a note saying, regarding, you seem to have some misconceptions about the organization. Let us set you straight. Here's a brochure. Here's an application to be a fellow. And by the way, here's the newsletter. The letter concluded, we hope that you will become a member of the African Studies Association. Not a single member of the caucus joined the association in spite of this recruitment campaign. At the May board meeting, the preliminary version of the report was discussed, and some action items, and again, apologies for the slide, were taken. The board decided to invite some associate members who had PhDs to become full fellows. Also, there were plans to move the annual meeting from Pittsburgh to Baton Rouge in New Orleans. And then finally, what I have up on the slide were the sort of major conclusions that the committee came to. And I want to focus on two here because I think they're interesting. First of all, a clearer articulation of the intellectual links between African and African American studies, including comparative studies. And then the third one, facilitating articulation of and evaluation of, in quotation marks, the Black point of view. Now, the committee found this a very troubling problem, and it's worth quoting at a bit of length because I think it illustrates how the problem of Black representation in the ASA becomes a Black problem and not a problem for the association or for the white membership. It is clear that the members of the Black Caucus feel that this is a very important goal, yet most members of the association probably are unsure as to what is this Black point of view. Thus, the problem is that Black members of the association who hold this view must describe and illustrate what Black scholars and the Black community perceive as the Black point of view. This requires the sound documentation of errors in fact, emphasis, or interpretation by non-Black scholars and researchers. From this, it may be possible to state what kinds of research Black scholars may be able to do better than, or at least differently from, non-Black scholars, and so it went on. Now, in its summary conclusion, the committee acknowledged that Full implementation of any suggestions would require a successful bid for foundation support. Meanwhile, it noted that its efforts to increase Black membership had been less successful than we should have wished, and acknowledged that they had not really made substantial progress in articulating a clear sense of the links between African and African American studies. The final substantive paragraph of the committee's report noted that its goals and progress must be examined not only in and of themselves, but in light of the formation of the African Heritage Studies Association, an organization of Black scholars. Indeed, by the time the board took this committee report under review in October, the report was not only bureaucratically overburdened, but significantly out of date. History was moving far faster than the board, as so many things were in 1968, and amelioration was no longer on the table. After the Los Angeles meeting, members of the Black Caucus met in June 1969 in Washington, D.C. to inaugurate a new association, the African Heritage Studies Association, with John Henrik Clark as president and Nicholas Onyewu as Secretary General. In his report, Confrontation at Montreal, Clark explains, quote, that the need for self-help among Black scholars and the need for the relevancy of the Black scholars to ASA served as an impetus for the association. AHSA members showed up in Montreal with a clear plan. Meanwhile, by the time the board was prepared to consider Gibbs's report, the annual meeting at Montreal was already underway, and according to Clark, the report was a gesture, but it was distributed too late to have any effect on the conference. It was too little, too late. The first direct action in Montreal, 1969, occurred during a plenary session on Thursday morning when activists seized the microphone and between 50 and 100 people moved to the front of the room. AHSA activists set forth their demands, which included an immediate change in the ideological framework of the ASA, and the constitution of a new board composed of 12 members, 6 African, 6 European, this is the terminology that was used, and parity in decisions that have to do with allocation of funds for research and publication. Now, the board agreed to take some of these demands under consideration, but refused to resign and argued that all of these demands would have to go before the fellows of the association. They agreed, however, that they would appoint 3 additional Black board members. The AHSA rejected this offer, insisting 6-6. Now, while some panels and conference business continued, at the business meeting later that day, with some 1,200 in attendance, imagine that, the business meeting, we had 7. That's when things came to a head, with the AHSA issuing a formal demand for parity on a new board consisting of 6 white and 6 Black members. Their motion was defeated by a vote of 107 to 97. Recall that only fellows could vote. At that point, Fred Burke, then a professor of political science at SUNY Buffalo, stood up and said, and I quote, speaking on behalf of a group of 25 concerned white liberals, he offered a new motion for a committee to be established of 30 people, men and women elected by the fellows and by members of the association in attendance and those who were just at the convention. Thus completely, goodbye fellows. Okay. Half white, half Black. That committee of 30 would draft a new constitution, which would be voted on by the entire membership in April. The board under this new constitution would be 50-50 white African. This became known as the Burke Resolution, and it was, as it was called, and it passed by a wide margin at those who attended the business meeting. Now, after that, there was almost this air of calm, that there was this sort of truce, but it didn't last very long. Correspondence received by the ASA in the aftermath of Montreal, as well as the commentaries that were published in Africa Today, definitely worth looking at, are a clear indication of how deep the divisions were. Almost immediately, a number of white commentators charged Black racism. Pierre Vandenberg, for example, wrote in Africa Today, By a clever combination of intimidation and play on the racial guilt of white American members of the association, a small and totally unrepresentative group of racists succeeded in imposing on the association a racial definition of the situation and in stampeding a flock of bewildered, self-styled liberals into accepting the principle of apartheid within the association. Pandering to black racism is, of course, the easiest thing for establishment liberals to do. A not dissimilar set of sentiments circulated in a letter originally penned by Rupert Emerson, Robert Rotberg, Joseph Nye, and Martin Kilson, but eventually signed by dozens of others, including Philip Curtin and other former and future ASA leaders. They argued that, as they saw it, a small group of persons operating as the Black Caucus or on behalf of the AHSA took it upon themselves to disrupt key features of the meeting by physical force in order to impose their demands, one of which was the division of the ASA into Africans and Europeans. To yield to the threatened violence which lay behind the disruption seems to us profoundly unlikely to achieve the goal of bringing together on a non-racial basis scholars and others interested in all aspects of Africa and its role in the world. Of course, what is most striking here are the ways in which the concept of non-racial was deployed by some of the leading white scholars of the day, particularly the ways in which the concept of African is purposefully and adamantly de-racialized. Pierre Vandenberg's comment in Africa Today exemplifies this most clearly. He wrote, "The fundamental need of the ASA was to Africanize the association, not to racialize it. It chose the latter course, and by doing so, it has become less African and more American than it was before." Now, we could talk at length about that, but I'm just going to move on. Some white scholars in the ASA leadership assumed a more progressive stance, demonstrating that there was more than one way to be white in the ASA in 1969. Immanuel Wallerstein, for example, saw the demands as creating the possibility of constructive steps forward. A modern democratic society that doesn't find some form to recognize the equal rights of groups along with and addition to the equal rights of individuals is simply according a constant differential advantage to the dominant group or groups. What happened in Montreal was useful for ASA, and for all those who were there, it offered us the possibility of redemption. There was also one group of white radicals that emerged. This group was, at Montreal, this group was led by Adrian Resnick, and it came out in full support of the demands of the Black Caucus and the AHSA, calling for the full and immediate democratization of the ASA and for parity. And if those demands were not met, quote, then we will consider forming another organization and disrupting ASA activities. Meanwhile, African and African American scholars published commentaries in Africa Today or simply wrote directly to the board, and they were largely unanimous in their support for the AHSA Black Caucus demands. As far as I know, historian Nell Painter wrote in her letter to the ASA, "The African Studies Association has never divorced itself from the racial climate of the United States. White opponents of the Black Caucus's positions cite black racism as its most odious aspect, yet they never work to correct the white racism which keeps universities and therefore the ASA nearly lily white. Has the ASA disassociated itself from American racism? Have members asked why there's so few black people in the association? Has the association taken meaningful steps toward changing the conditions which keep most black students from reaching a level where they might even know of the existence of the African Studies Association?" Given the intensity of the post-Montreal fallout, it's not surprising that that truce briefly brokered by the Burke Resolution crumbled in the weeks that followed. Now, at first, the ASA and the AHSA continued to negotiate, to talk. Two groups sat down together at Columbia University, and at that meeting, they actually agreed that they would put together a committee with parity. They agreed on parity. Each would select 5 members, and they would sit down and make recommendations for restructuring the ASA. The principle is clearly understood, and this is a quote, "of parity in the case of representatives of AHSA and of ASA in both groups," jointly signed. Then in early December, the ASA, in another promising move, abolished the College of Fellows. But at the very same time that these positive developments were unfolding, ASA Vice President Philip Curtin argued, quote, "Well, before useful discussion can be held, with members of the AHSA, the board needed to have guidance from its membership. Now, this diversionary move, what I'm calling a diversionary move, was clearly intended to forestall, if not end, any board effort to follow through on the Burke Resolution or the revised resolution agreed upon by the ASA and the AHSA. So Curtin develops this questionnaire that he sends out to the membership. Now, almost all the black members have resigned, right? So this is the questionnaire. And basically, you just click the one you want. And it goes from the extreme in one way, which the board of directors resigns, and we start from scratch, parity. And then the other extreme is, we're not going to do anything, really. And then the one right above that is the one that most people chose, who voted, okay? And I'll let you read that. But while members are pondering this questionnaire, plans were moving forward to hold the next annual meeting in New Orleans, with Joseph E. Harris, then professor of African history at Williams, agreeing to serve as the program chair. And with a fair amount of confidence, people thought the AHSA was going to participate fully. The two groups met again in January, but at that point, any path forward was improbable, if not impossible. Although the ASA Fellows voted in favor of abolishing the college and instituting one form of general membership, by April, the AHSA had no interest in any kind of joint efforts. The reasons were clear. First, the AHSA learned that Philip Curtin was one of the signatories to that Rotberg, Kilson, and Emerson letter. Quote, the members of the AHSA considered this letter to be a racist attack on African scholarship in general and on the members of the AHSA in particular. This is John Henry Clark. We did not know that Dr. Philip D. Curtin was a signer of this letter when we attended the January meeting. We do not believe that any of the members of the ASA who signed this can deal with African people in good faith. Secondly, and more importantly, or no, as importantly, at its meeting, the votes came in and that said, we'll go for number 3 on the list. And so it became clear that the ASA in no way was going to support any kind of parity. With that resolution, they made it clear. Indeed, after meeting with the board and expressing his concerns, Joseph Harris resigned as program chair. He explained that he had hoped that the ASA would meet the demands of the Black Caucus. However, and I quote, the events of Montreal and subsequent discussion and the general dynamics and political formalities have resulted in a failure of the ASA to achieve the understanding and cooperation so essential for the kind of meaningful program I would have organized and presented. At that point, those few AHSA members who had held on to their membership resigned and New Orleans was canceled. But this was not quite the end of the story. There was yet one last attempt from within the board to follow through with the demands made in Montreal. Johnnetta Cole and Willard Johnson, both African-American scholars, were elected to the board that very spring and came on as members at a meeting in Boston in October 1970. At that meeting, they put forward a resolution very much in the spirit of Montreal, that the African Studies Association needed to commit itself to work for the dignified survival and liberation of African people. They also moved that some of the funds from the ASA go to an African Liberation Fund, that there be at least one plenary session organized by the AHSA and one organized by African scholars at the meeting, and then the fourth clause bringing the Burke Resolution back onto the table. Now, it went before the membership at the business meeting, where it was approved by a vote of 151 to 138 with 13 abstentions. After the business meeting, a heated discussion takes place among board members on what steps should be taken. Would the Cole-Johnson resolution undermine the ASA's tax-exempt status? Should the resolution go to the full membership via a mail ballot? In the end, that's precisely what the board decided to do. So the resolution went to the membership by mail, just as it had the year before, and the results could have been predicted, given who was still left in the organization. 271 affirmed the resolution, 607 voted to repeal, and there was one abstention. Johnson and Cole both resigned from the board. Now, in an attempt to repair this breach, Curtin crafted a lengthy letter to the membership announcing that he was going to introduce measures to address some of the concerns behind the resolution, but his appeal to compromise clung fiercely to Herskovits' vision of U.S. African studies as objective, non-racial, and detached. As damage control in 1970, his appeal was not effective. Between 1970 and 71, the association lost 438 individual members and 76 institutional members. It is clear, the secretary of the association wrote to members, that the tail of the Montreal hurricane swept over us in 71. A number of members confused the association with a university, and other members seemed to believe it is a political party. My own view, which is almost always wrong, is that we have survived the last 2 years in rather good shape. I expect that, barring disaster, the current membership is a base upon which we can build. In this instance, I guess the secretary would have been proven correct. The ASA did build on that diminished base and managed to survive the nadir of 68-71. How and why would take me far beyond the scope of my remarks tonight. But suffice it to say that on the one hand, members who stayed in began organizing in new and different ways within the association, finding community in different offshoot or coordinate organizations. So that sort of begins in the wake of this. On the other hand, it is extremely important, I think, that the leadership of the ASA, Immanuel Wallerstein, Absalom Vilakazi, under their leadership, began to pass political resolutions, including on Guinea-Bissau, and sought different ways of collaborating with the AHSA. In fact, the two organizations, a lot of people don't remember this, sent a joint delegation to the International Congress of Africanists in Addis Ababa in December 1973, and John Henrik Clark was the representative of both those associations on the international executive of the ICA. Dr. Shelby Faye Lewis, who is with us tonight, was also a member of that delegation. There was also extensive planning in 74 and 75 for a joint meeting in Ithaca, New York, of representatives of the two associations for the spring of 75, but in the end, however, and for a variety of issues, logistical, ideological, that meeting never happened. Perhaps the center of gravity had shifted, but the moment for mutual collaboration for total parity had passed. And the question posed as rupture in 68, 69, 71, they still hung in the air. They still, I think, haunt us. Decolonizing the ASA, or hashtag Herskovits must fall. One way to interpret the histories I've recounted is by way of an ascension narrative that might applaud the critical role of the Black Caucus of 68, that the African Heritage Studies Association of 69 played in saving the ASA from the worst of itself. And certainly there's some truth in that interpretation. There's no more College of Fellows. The racial and national demographics of the organization have changed over the years. And through the local arrangements committees, we reach out to K-12 teachers during annual meetings. And the association, as an association, has kept its distance, for the most part, from U.S. state security initiatives and has been far more willing to take a stance on what would have been considered by Herskovits political issues. But when we look at the demands of the Black Caucus, how far has the ASA really come? How far do we still need to go? What is the unfinished business of 1968? My own position is that there's still much work to be done on at least 3 fronts that were absolutely central to the demands of 68 and 69. First, and perhaps foremost, we have not figured out, as an association, a way to be African studies in the racialized landscape that is and will continue to be the United States. This was a foundational problem in 1958. It is carried on through 68, 98, into 2018. From the ASA's inception, far too many white scholars have inhabited African studies in alignment with Herskovits' founding vision as a kind of space safe from, outside of race, a non-racial space, where we don't have to, in fact, mustn't think about race, racialized subjects, whiteness, privilege, or racism, except, as Jemima Pierre has pointed out, in the context of quite circumscribed research areas like apartheid South Africa. This is the serious part. Okay. A racially sanitized encounter between Africans and non-Africans in the current situations, as Mkandawari warned in '96, involves a large dose of self-deception. In fact, many of us witnessed such self-deception the previous year in 1995 when former ASA President Philip Curtin wrote an editorial in the Chronicle of Higher Education entitled Ghettoizing African History, in which he decried the fact that talented white scholars were not getting jobs because those jobs were going to less qualified black scholars in what Curtin claimed to be a form of intellectual apartheid that was only ghettoizing African history. The echoes of Curtin's 1969 stance in 1995 stand in stubborn defiance of any ascension narrative. While his remarks certainly sparked outrage among many in the African studies community in '95, not only in the pages of the Chronicle, but in that town hall, many of you were at it, at the annual ASA meeting that year, it was not, I fear, the last gasp of a dying vision of African studies in the US. The non-racial, racially sanitized version of African studies, a version that tenaciously clings to the idea that African studies can exist in the United States outside of the racist realities of the United States, is never far beneath the surface. It continues to haunt our being. Indeed, the conservative white backlash to the demands of '68 and '69 was premised on non-racialism and consisted primarily of charges of reverse racism, apartheid, as opponents decried the division of the membership into racial categories that could be counted. Now, those of you who know me know I am a qualitative, not a quantitative historian, and I understand well that numbers can obfuscate, invisibilize, steamroll over nuance, complexity, and much else. But I also know that racism, ignorance, white supremacy, and complacency endure, indeed thrive, when we don't count, when we refuse to count, especially when hiding behind a banner of non-racialism. One of the biggest demands in 1968 and '69 was for parity. Parity requires counting, imperfect though our categories might be, and counting brings patterns into sharper relief. 61 years into our history, what do some of the ASA numbers look like? Here's a slide that I didn't make, but my son did. But I did the numbers, because I don't know how to do this stuff. These are the ASA presidents by the numbers over our entire history. I think they kind of speak for themselves, but I'll leave it up for a second. People say, well, but we're getting better. So I broke it down into these 20-year time slots, and there does appear to be, the long history is not a pretty one, but even this one isn't exactly beautiful. Still 55% white, 60% male, and I would like to point out in this and in the previous chart, not a single African woman, okay? More interesting, let's look at the Herskovits Prize. Now, the prize has been given for 53 years, but there are 73 winners of the prize because sometimes we have co-authors, and sometimes two different books get the prize. And I thought, that's interesting. It turns out that 33% of the time that a scholar of color has won the award was shared with the second winner, who was a white man. Again, no African women. Over 75% of the awards have gone to white scholars. And we also see a trend, I think that's quite common in academia and in corporate America, which is that diversity inclusion ends up benefiting white women more than any other group. But the exception to that rule may be, I'm still working on this one, is the Distinguished Africanist Award, which has a kind of a distinct gender bend to it. So this award started in '87. It's been given 35 times. 83% of the awards have gone to men, 48.6% to white men. No African American or African woman has ever been awarded this distinction, ever. Now, The reasons for that, I think, are pretty obvious. It's a product of who teaches where, who gets graduate students, because then you get older, and then your graduate students nominate you for the award, and then you're distinguished, right? At least that's my take on the thing. Okay. I would be the first to assert that these numbers, these visualizations, do not capture the multiple complex identities, gender, race, ethnicity, class, nation, religion, or citizenship that make up each and every individual who has won an ASA award, served as president, or indeed is sitting in this room. But they do reveal clear patterns of privilege and power that have changed over time, but have not been displaced, disrupted, or transcended, even in the most recent past. And when we think about the unfinished business of '68, these numbers are, as they were then, a place to start. Secondly, and as I argued earlier, the emergence of this Africanist enterprise, an enterprise buttressed by the massive influx of foundation and government funds, facilitated a recolonization of Africa by the U.S., with U.S. academics overwhelmingly white, serving as the gatekeepers and determining on an unprecedented scale what knowledge could be produced, what questions should be asked, and what was of value. That the consolidation of that enterprise more or less coincided with the underfunding of public universities in many parts of the continent in the late 70s only exacerbated the global inequities and the entrenched coloniality of knowledge production. A coloniality which scholars on the continent, from Accra to Dar es Salaam, from Addis to Dakar, had contested with some success in the 60s and early 70s. Today, continental organizations like CODESRIA and more recently the African Studies Association of Africa are at the forefront of recentering knowledge production about Africa in Africa. What role will the ASA play, can it play, in support of this decolonizing work, in opening up the gates and displacing the gatekeepers? Thirdly, and finally, there's the question of the ASA's relationship to the study of global Africa and the African diaspora. As I combed through the papers of the ASA, the Black Caucus, the AHSA, I was surprised how critical that issue was in the late 60s. As Black Studies departments were birthed out of Black student struggle, the question being posed by so many African American and African members of the ASA was, where are we? Where is the ASA in this process? Are we at the table? Now, before I dug into the archives, I wasn't aware that during these very critical years, and especially in '68, Black scholars in the ASA struggled to push the ASA into the work of building Black studies across the United States. In other words, there was a moment of incredible possibility when the ASA might have played a supportive role in those struggles, including at TWIs. But the ASA leadership at that time rejected outright any such cross-fertilization. And so to this day, at most campuses across the country, where there is both African studies and African American studies, they largely occupy different spaces, have different faculty, and pursue agendas that are seldom overlapping. That is one of the major legacies of 1969. So how does the ASA as an association reckon with this past, with this genealogy? Is there a redemption song? In the last few years, the ASA board has headed up really important initiatives in terms of publication, circulation of published works. We had our first Africa-based program chair for this year's annual meeting, and that will be repeated next year and hopefully every year after. We have a commitment to having Africa-based scholars serve on the board. Our advocacy committee now works with a large and representative task force on academic freedom, and these are important steps that will certainly bring about additive change, but will they bring about transformative change? I believe in fundamental ways that what would transformative change actually look like? I believe in fundamental ways that I am not the person to make that determination, and therefore will not end my remarks with a 7-point development plan. My hope is that initial conversations can begin in the 2 roundtables tomorrow, the first on ruptures, the second on futures, where we will have the opportunity to listen to several generations think through the past, the present, and the future of African studies, of knowledge production about Africa, and perhaps begin to chart out what transformative change for the ASA might entail. And I'm extremely grateful for every single person on both of those slides who has agreed to participate, some coming from a very long distance, some who haven't stepped foot in an ASA meeting since 1969. Must Herskovits fall as part and parcel of transformative change? Well, I said I was going to be quiet, but I'll just add my 2 cents in here. I have, in fact, thought a lot about the ASA's most coveted prize, and I used to think it was really important that the prize was named after someone whose work had such an impact on how scholars conceptualize the Africanness of global Africans. But I know now that that was not what the Founding Fathers had in mind in 1963. It was a memorial to a foundational player in the North American political economy of knowledge production about Africa, a political economy owned and operated overwhelmingly by white scholars at TWIs. The first Herskovits Prize was given in 1965. That prize was not endowed. The board wrote to publishers and asked them to contribute, which many did for 5 years, but then began withdrawing their support in '69. At that time, at the time of Montreal, there were some efforts to raise funds from Herskovits' students, but those were not successful. So the prize has remained without an endowment, without a vision statement, without a serious conversation about what was and is being memorialized, celebrated. I would like to see a critical discussion of this prize and others, symbolic though they may be. Perhaps the prize has generated a dynamic of its own that most people don't connect to any particular past, a particular set of decisions. Given the flawless moments we have witnessed across the globe over these past 2 years, I suspect that that's not actually the case. In his presidential lecture 60 years ago, Herskovits made clear how much he valued what he considered to be Americans remove our distance in space from the African scene. Thankfully, I have met few people in this association in my 30+ years as a member who share that value. So maybe there are alternatives to a Herskovits Prize. Perhaps we should look to the continent and to those who work so hard to decolonize the production of knowledge about Africa as their countries struggled for independence. The historian Kenneth Dike comes to mind, the person who organized the first International Congress of Africanists in 1962 in Accra. Or perhaps our most prestigious award should recognize some of those who struggled to save the ASA from the worst of itself in '68 or '69, some of whom are with us today. Or perhaps we should return in Sankofa style to that other genealogy, to that other river of knowledge production that my predecessor, James Pritchett, so eloquently described a few years ago in his presidential lecture. And we should recognize someone like William Leo Hansberry, probably the first person to teach African studies in any serious way in the United States in the 1920s without funding, without research support from any foundation, any government department. How might the ASA honor that deep and rich African-American history of African studies while also acknowledging the association's role in its marginalization and displacement? Thank you.